Welcome to another Talking Feds One-on-One. I'm Harry Littman. As of this recording, we're a few days into a ceasefire between Israel, Iran, and the United States, but the lead up to that ceasefire was a spiral toward war. Israel launched attacks inside of Iran, killing senior military leaders and nuclear scientists, as well as civilians. And Iran responded with missile attacks on Israel, also killing civilians, but with little military impact. But to cap it all, the United States, as we all know, dropped a series of huge bombs on Iran in an effort to stop the country from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to obliterate the sites of the accumulation to date of nuclear materials. Then, after a fairly harmless retaliatory attack, Iran stood down and has, for now, accepted Trump's ceasefire. Each side, as is typical in the Middle East, has claimed victory. But this second wave of news has converted what had been a series of exclamation points where Trump and Vance proclaimed a perfect military exercise and the annihilation of Iran's nuclear capacity into question marks and a series of opaque issues, military, political, and strategic. To help us make sense of where things stand now and what is the likelihood and consequences of future skirmishes, I'm very pleased to welcome one of the preeminent experts on Iran in this country, Karim Sadjadpour. Karim's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a contributing writer for The Atlantic, and an adjunct professor at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. Previously, he was an analyst for the International Crisis Group, based in Tehran and Washington. He regularly advises leaders in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. on how to understand Iran. In recent days, his op-ed in the New York Times, What Bombs Can't Do in Iran, as well as several interviews have helped illuminate the perennially opaque area where some people at least fear the next world war may be brewing. So forgive that somewhat overlong intro. And Karim, thank you so much for joining Talking Fed.
Thank you for inviting me, Harry. It's great to be with you.
All right, let's start with the kind of reversals or temporizing from this first triumphant set of announcements from the administration. Truth be told, as we are here, we don't really have a clear sense yet of how much damage the U.S. attacks did to Iran's nuclear program. Rather than speculate on the damage, I just want to ask you, as you see it, will these attacks change the regime's commitment to developing a bomb whatever place they are now in?
Well, Harry, there's a danger that it could change the regime's disposition towards a bomb in a negative way. What I mean by that is that prior to this attack, it was long my view that for Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, his endgame was not necessarily to detonate a nuclear weapon like North Korea. In my view, he was in pursuit of what's commonly called the Japan model, to have a nuclear weapons capability, to get as close as you possibly can to that capability, what we call a screwdriver turn away, but not necessarily to turn that screw, because he understood a couple of things. Number one, if he did make a dash for nuclear weapon, it would trigger exactly what just happened, which is an invasion of his nuclear program. But number two, there are internal reasons that he may not have wanted to actually detonate a bomb and develop nuclear device, which is that he risks ceding power to his military, the Revolutionary Guards, who would actually control that nuclear program. So now, after this attack has taken place, I think the debate in Iran is obviously very much shifted. And there's a lot of people who would argue now inside the regime, not necessarily society, but inside the regime, that Iran's mistake wasn't that it had a nuclear program. Its mistake was not more rapidly acquiring a nuclear weapon. Because they look at the world and they see that countries that either gave up their nuclear option or didn't acquire one, like Gaddafi's Libya, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Ukraine, they all made themselves vulnerable to an external military intervention, whereas countries like North Korea and Pakistan, who actually acquired nuclear weapons, provided themselves a cloak of immunity. So there is a danger here, and I'm not saying this is a foregone conclusion. We're in real time now, and we'll only know with the benefit of hindsight. But there certainly is a concern that, to the extent we've shifted the debate in Iran, we've strengthened the arguments of the more kind of aggressive forces in that Iranian regime who say we don't need a nuclear weapons capability, we need nuclear weapons.
See, we need to adopt the North Korea model, and everyone will be afraid of us. I just wanted to follow up a little on your point about, and you've written regularly in the past that Iran's decision has been largely not to be at the actual screwdriver turned stage, has been political rather than technical. And you've just now described the kind of political dynamic that confronts the supreme leader. So can explain a little bit more in those calculations. What role might the military play, and what leverage might it obtain that it doesn't have now vis-a-vis the supreme leader and internal Iranian politics?
So the supreme leader is a cleric. He's 86 years old. He's arguably the longest-serving autocrat in the world. He's been ruling since 1989, when he took over for the founder of the 1979 revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini. So he's someone who's, had very good survival instincts. He's, I call him Ayatollah Machiavelli, as good kind of clever Machiavellian politician.
Yeah.
And he has, in part, risen to the top and preserved his authority because of his relationship with the Revolutionary Guards. He's cultivated them, he's indulged them economically. The military has gotten very wealthy. But ultimately, he wants Iran to survive as an Islamic republic. He doesn't want Iran to transform into a military dictatorship. And so for that reason, he's been very careful about changing the leadership positions of the military. Every year he shuffles them, so no one can get too comfortable in their role and start to challenge his authority. And we've seen this in other contexts throughout history, that civilian leaders are a little ambivalent about acquiring nuclear devices because they are paranoid. These systems, we're not talking about monolithic systems, so there's a lot of interpower rivalry. And in the case of the leader, it's a valid concern for him that if the military gets a bomb, they may no longer defer to him as their commander-in-chief. And one more historic context, which is relevant here, Harry. In 1979, we had the Islamic Revolution in Iran. The Shah of Iran collapsed. And there's a wonderful book that was written about the collapse of the Shah called Intelligence Failure by a scholar called Robert Jervis. And Robert Jervis was asking the question, why? Well, first of all, why did the CIA miss this? We totally were blindsided by this. In August of 1978, the CIA assessed with high confidence that Iran was not even in a pre-revolutionary state. And 5 months later, the Shah was gone. So why did the CIA miss this? One of the reasons why was that nobody knew that the Shah had terminal cancer. And that profoundly affected his calculations. And one of the ways in which it affected his calculations is that he already knew that he planned to bequeath power to his son. And so the question was, why didn't the Shah use more force to stay in power? Because he still had, powerful military that was intact. And, why didn't he just crush these protests like so many other Middle Eastern autocrats did? And one of the reasons—
And just quickly to set it up, the assumption is he could have, because I remember watching from afar and it seemed like the country was completely overrun. But your assumption is, no, he could have, in fact, strong-armed the emerging Revolutionary Guard from obtaining power?
We'll never know. It's one of those
Okay.
counterfactuals. But certainly you're right. By late 1978, it was almost impossible for him to reverse engineer this revolution. But I'm talking kind of early on in the revolution, let's say, in the spring of 1978. And, Harry, as I said, like the CIA's had a lot of people on the ground in Iran, and they assessed even by August of 78 that the country wasn't in a pre-revolutionary state. So, one of the Shah's calculations was he feared if he relied too heavily on the military, that when he wanted to bequeath power to his son, he was going to make his son the puppet of the military rather than its master. So I think there's a parallel here with Ayatollah Khamenei, who's also perhaps thinking about, bequeathing power to his son, or have his son, who's 55 years old, also a cleric, be in the conversation for succession. And, if that's the case, he wants his son not to be the puppet of the Revolutionary Guards, but their master, in which case providing the Revolutionary Guards nuclear weapons, may undermine that goal of having
counterproductive. Yeah. So I just want to summarize and make sure I've got this dynamic right. So on the one hand, you say providing them nuclear weapons, but so the notion would be if nuclear weapons exist in the country, the military could almost by force take control of them and have the leverage against the supreme leader. That's point one. And the other thing that we need to keep in mind that you've emphasized is he's a cleric, and he really there are emerging secular forces in Iran, and his sort of lookout politically is that the religious aspect of the regime abide after his death. Are those the sort of basic? Do I have those accurately?
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah. And again, he. Well, yeah, no, I don't need to belabor it further.
Fair enough. No, I just wanted to summarize and make sure I had it.
Yeah.
Okay, so. Well, so right now it does seem, it did seem to most people, even those for whom the Middle East is generally opaque, that attack, as it were, on the U.S. base in Qatar was fairly perfunctory and not so muscular. So, and if that's right, I would think that the ball remains in Iran's court. Without asking you to predict the future, I just, what goes into, if that's correct, and it's thereby a matter for them about whether they'll respect the ceasefire, how do you, versus more retaliation, what's the kind of calculation and set of considerations that you think inform that decision?
Well, I agree with you that their attack on the U.S. base in Qatar was performative, symbolic. It wasn't meant to cause real damage and casualties. Listen, the challenge Iran has is that many of its options for retaliation are what I would call the tactical equivalent of a suicide bombing, right? It will do enormous damage to their adversaries, but they may not survive the blowback, depending on what that is. So we can talk about those briefly. They could go after U.S. embassies and U.S. military bases in a significant way in countries like Iraq and throughout the Persian Gulf. They could bomb oil installations in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They could try to block major trade corridors like the Strait of Hormuz, disrupt global oil flows. They could try to rain a missile barrage on Israel. But all of those options that they have potentially huge ramifications. So in part, I think what Iran is trying to, will need to do is it depends on their reading of President Trump and the reading of Prime Minister Netanyahu. This is a country which right now doesn't really control its own airspace. They're naked. And so you could argue it would be unwise for them to throw punches at a time when they don't really have a shield. And so historically, what Iran has done under these circumstances is it bides its time. And when the world has moved on to other topics, President Trump has moved on to other topics, as they say, revenge is a dish best served cold, and that's when they act. But, this is a regime which has been profoundly humiliated, emasculated. Its proxies in the region have been decimated. Its nuclear program, which cost the nation perhaps upwards of $500 billion, has been badly damaged. And I should just kind of reemphasize, Harry, they're led by an 86-year-old supreme leader. He's living in a bunker. He's ruling a Swiss cheese regime, totally, penetrated by Israeli intelligence. His top military commanders have been assassinated. So, he's someone who, at that age, you have limited bandwidth even to play with your grandchildren, let alone, lead a war against the greatest superpower in the world, the region's greatest military power, and your own population. So I'd say for now, this is a regime in survival mode. They want to stay in power. He wants to stay alive and in power. And I think the likelihood that they will massively retaliate in the near term is unlikely.
That's really interesting and persuasive. And I'll just say, as the counterpoint, when you laid out the options, it's so distinctive as to the Middle East. Somebody like Iran has the different targets that they could actually retaliate toward UAE or Saudi Arabia because everything is so interrelated. I want to ask one question about capacity because you did mention it. You said that their proxies have been decimated, referring to Hezbollah and Hamas. Do you think that's right? Wherever they now stand, do you think their ability to support, fund, promote the terrorist entities who have been, very important players and bad ones in the Middle East is, at least for now, a dead letter?
Not a dead letter, but it's been significantly degraded. We can talk about them briefly one by one. So basically, Iran was dominating 5 Arab lands: Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Gaza. They called that their axis of resistance. And those countries were all basically failed or failing states. So that is what Iran had done very effectively the last 2 decades in the Middle East. They were good at filling power vacuums in countries that were fraught with, civil war, tension, weak governments. And I call it the McDonaldization of Hezbollah. They created this Hezbollah franchise in Lebanon in the 1980s, and then they franchised
Not a happy meal, though, I gotta say. But
not a happy meal. No, it's a sad. They call it the axis of resistance, and it's really the axis of misery, because the places that Iran had power and influence were, places that were really suffering. Now, look at what's happened to them post October 7th. And by the way, Harry, the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023, turned out to be one of the great miscalculations in modern geopolitical history. The leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, thought that it would lead to Israel's destabilization. And Iran was the only country in the world, Iran's supreme leader was the only leader in the world that supported that. And you see what a reversal it's been.
It sure seems like it, yeah.
Yeah. And so of those proxies, Hezbollah was really decimated. And you see that now, that Hezbollah didn't show any reaction to Iran getting bombed. In the past, that would have been one of Iran's major sources of retaliation. Hamas, we've seen, has been decimated. Bashar Assad, their only real friend in the Middle East, collapsed last December. So it's a totally different government now in power in Damascus. And the 2 remaining proxies, the Shia militias in Iraq and the Houthis in Yemen, have been somewhat chastened. The Houthis are the ones that are the biggest wild card. They are younger than the other proxies, and so they have kind of that adolescent radicalism, whereas the Shia militias in Iraq, I think, they want to, they've made a lot of money. They want to preserve that. They're not interested in getting into a fight with America and Israel. But for the most part, Iran's ability to project power in the Middle East significantly degraded over the last year.
Yeah, and my sense is that in the politics of the Middle East, you would know better, but that the sort of humiliation factor really has its own political salience.
Talking Feds is supported by the Brennan Center for Justice. In this new political era, the Brennan Center will do what they do best: defend the Constitution and the rule of law. They're prepared to fight against presidential overreach and will continue advocating for reforms to resist weaponized government, stop billionaires from corrupting our elections, and ensure every eligible American has the freedom to vote. Stay informed by visiting BrennanCenter.org.
And I wanted to ask you, look, you're a brilliant and accomplished scholar. You spent your life on it, but you have a personal connection as well. Your folks were born there, and you've spent a lot of time professionally. I imagine you know people, have friends there. Do you have a sense of how Iranians are reacting to the attacks from the United States? What's the sort of internal feel of the people?
It's a very good question, and I think it's evolved because the first 24 hours when people woke up in Iran Friday morning, I guess it was 8 days ago. That my history is not blurry, but just in the last couple of weeks, when Israel first invaded, Iranians woke up and they saw that these senior Revolutionary Guard commanders, almost 24 of them, were eliminated overnight. They were either assassinated while sleeping in their bedrooms or in their bunkers. And these figures for many Iranians, and I would argue probably 8 out of 10 people in Iran, are not supporters of the regime, because it's a regime which is socially repressive, it's politically repressive, and it's profoundly mismanaged the country economically. So when suddenly
And if I can just add, you would know this better, but I think of the Iranians as really being very different, unique among the people of the Middle East for having a kind of sophisticated worldly background that has been really wrenched backwards since 1979. So there's that kind of secular, sophisticated tradition that is different from other countries that probably informs this. Is that fair?
100%. I mean, this is a 2,500-year-old civilization, which this revolution is now distilled to 3 things. It's death to America, death to Israel, and the mandatory veiling of women. That's not a winning argument for the 21st century. And, Iranians have paid the cost of that, because it should be, in my view, a G20 nation, and it's instead one of the most isolated countries in the world. And so when people woke up and the folks, these military commanders whom they had associated with repression were suddenly killed, and there was no cost to the average person because those were very targeted assassinations, I think many people quietly, even not so quietly, were celebrating. But then when it became an urban war and the city of Tehran was being bombed, and President Trump and Israeli officials told Tehran residents to evacuate, and it created mayhem. People couldn't get gasoline. There was gridlock. They couldn't get out. And it created real anxiety. There have been several hundred civilian casualties. No population wants to live under those conditions. And, what I tell people is that Israelis have been accustomed to these missile wars. In Israel, there's now, it's a protocol. It's something that, unfortunately, they've gotten used to. They go to the shelter, and then, when it's passed, they can go back and go on with their lives. But for Iranians, the Islamic Republic had been fighting Israel for the most part from Arab soil over the last decades. And so when Israel retaliated, it was the people of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen who bore the brunt of that. This is the first time that the war has come to Iranian soil. The Iran-Israel war has come to Iranian soil. So people weren't accustomed to that. And I think that changed their views about it. And now that it appears that the dust has settled, a lot of people are very fearful that their regime has been poked, it's been humiliated, and it's a regime which is too weak to retaliate against America and Israel. So just like an abusive father, it's going to take its anger out on its own population. And we've already started to see that they're rounding up a lot of people en masse. They're executing people.
3 executions this week, right? And 700 arrests. Yeah.
Yes.
That's sobering. And the conventional military wisdom, what do I know, but is that a regime change can't be effectuated by an air attack, even though, as you say, Iran is naked and the U.S. or Israel could bombard it and achieve a lot of damage. What do you, and I have the sense now that from what you've just said, people are afraid and kind of retrenched. So just generally speaking, do you have a sense of just what it might take, and I guess it'd be largely internal, to topple, it sounds like it would have to be both the theocrats and the Revolutionary Guards, and achieve regime change if it basically has to be internal and not from afar?
So there's a wonderful book on revolutions by a scholar called Jack Goldstone, and he likens revolutions to earthquakes. He says, we know which countries have fault lines, are highly seismic, but can never predict the moment of an earthquake. And likewise, Iran is a country which is highly seismic in that context. There's a lot of fault lines. One of the first things you would look for are emerging fissures among the political elites. Is the system starting to come apart? Are there defections? So far, we haven't seen that visibly, but we also know that it's a system which is totally penetrated by Israeli intelligence. So that's not to say that we won't see signs of that. Second, at the moment, and I guess it's building on that first point, at the moment, we see a regime from afar which looks to be united, highly armed, organized, and willing to kill en masse to stay in power. And it's a society which is unorganized, unarmed, leaderless, and not willing to die en masse to take power. And so people sometimes ask me, if 80%, as I said, of Iranians are upset, why don't they just, revolt? And your viewers who have lived under dictatorships will know that, it's very intimidating. When I was based in Tehran, and
that first step, how do you get there from there? Well, and let me ask you, you've identified two really prime, you could say reactionary or conservative forces, both the military and the theocrats. Is it your sense that at least vis-a-vis the prospect of regime change and popular revolt, they are united and will remain united? Sometimes the dynamic is the military leans toward popular dissent and the like. But do you see within Iran those two forces staying, joined at the hip?
Not necessarily. Right now, that appears that they are. We saw in the Arab Spring in places like Egypt and Tunisia, at some point when the anger and protest began to build so high against their autocrats, the military cut those autocrats loose to preserve their own power. So that is within the realm of possibilities in Iran. And it's also a possibility that, some leaders emerge within the military. As I've said, Revolutionary Guards are 190,000 men. They're not a monolith. There's the senior commanders who still believe in the revolution, but then there are others who, I'm not arguing that they're Democrats, but they may say, listen, we need to think about doing what China did in the 1970s. Instead of putting the cultural revolution and ideology ahead of everything, we need to put our economic and national interests before revolutionary ideology. We'll keep power for ourselves, but that will reduce the external threat and allow us to get wealthier. So that is also a possibility.
Got it. Okay, maybe this is a closeout for now. It's such a situation that's in process. But in theory, we have heard it said, if this is that Iran has repeatedly made signals that they're ready to come to the bargaining table, and that was one of the explanations for the tepid and, as you've put it as well, performative, but not so robust military response. You got to do something, but then come. Without predicting, I mean, in theory, Iran and the U.S. are going to be meeting to discuss a nuclear deal. What could possibly come of those talks? In other words, I'm not asking you to use a crystal ball, but rather to say what situation that is diplomatically achieved might be palatable to the regime, because presumably it would take them very far from the North Korea model, say we were just talking about. What would even be in the offing?
The challenge we have, Harry, is that in Washington right now, in my view, a big issue like this is really driven by the president, the person of the president. It's
a challenge, yeah.
And it's not clear to me that the president knows what his goal and end game is. And, these are very technical discussions. Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA, was 170-page, very technical document. And so if it's not clear to President Trump what his end game is, then certainly it hasn't been articulated to Iran, what our end game is. And so that type of confusion is not a recipe for success, because, as I said from the outset, there's a danger that the Iranians say, well, they just want, as President Trump said publicly, unconditional surrender. And unconditional surrender for dictatorships, it could be an internal death, because they feel like, they've been totally humiliated, emasculated. So the danger is that the regime says, in these two choices between unconditional surrender, or we take our chances and try to dash for a bomb, they take option two. That's why I think it's just imperative that we have a clear sense of what our end game is, and we communicate that using the channels of state, not Truth Social.
Yeah. And this is a cross-cutting point, of course, with the president, and might things change tomorrow? Karim Sadjadpour, it's such a we have a very important and very obscure situation, and to get the illumination from you is really great for Talking Feds listeners. Hope we can talk to you again, and thanks very much for your time.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.